Chapter 6. Scar, the vulture, winged his way leisurely, in great circles far above the right bank of the Ugogo. The pendant locket, sparkling in the sunlight, had ceased to annoy him while on the wing. Only when he alighted, and walked upon the ground, did it become an encumbrance. Then he stepped upon it, and tripped. But long since had he ceased to fight it, accepting it now, as an inescapable evil. Beneath him, he presently descried the still recumbent form of Gorgo, the buffalo, whose posture proclaimed that he was already fit food for Scar. The great bird dropped, alighting in a nearby tree. All was well, no foes were in evidence. Satisfied of this, Scar flapped down to the fallen beast. Miles away, a giant white man crouched in the concealment of a dense thicket, with a little black girl. The fingers of one of the man's hands were across her mouth, those of the other held a knife at her heart. The man's eyes were not upon the girl, but were straining through the dense foliage, toward a game trail, along which 2 ebon warriors were advancing. Succor was close at hand for Yuha, the daughter of Camis the witch doctor, for the 2 approaching were hunters from the village of Obb, the chief. But she dared not call aloud to attract them, lest the sharp point of Miranda's knife slip into her young heart. And so, she heard them come and go, until their voices lost in the distance. The Spaniard arose, and dragged her back upon the trail, where they took up what seemed to Yuha their endless and fruitless wanderings through the jungle. In the village of the Ant-Men, Tarzan found a warm welcome. And having decided to remain for a while, that he might study them, and their customs, he set to work, as was his wont, when thrown among strange peoples, to learn their language as quickly as possible. Having already mastered several languages, and numerous dialects, the ape-man never found it difficult to add to his linguistic attainments. And so, it was only a matter of a comparatively short time, before he found it possible to understand his hosts, and to make himself understood by them. It was then that he learned that they had at first thought that he was some form of Alalas, and had consequently believed that it ever would be impossible to communicate with him by other means than signs. They were greatly delighted therefore, when it had become apparent that he could utter vocal sounds identical to theirs. And when they comprehended that he desired to learn their tongue, Adandroharchis, the king, placed several instructors at his disposal, and gave orders that all his people, with whom the giant stranger might come in contact, should aid him to an early understanding of their language. Adandroharchis was particularly well inclined toward the ape-man, because of the fact that it had been the king's son, Commodore Florenzel, whom Tarzan had rescued from the clutches of the Alalas woman. And so, it was that everything was done to make the giant's stay among them a pleasant one. 100 slaves brought his food to him, where he had taken up his abode, beneath the shade of a great tree that grew in lonely majesty just outside the city. When he walked among the group of dome houses, a troop of cavalry galloped ahead to clear a path for him, lest he trod upon some of the people of the city. But always was Tarzan careful of his hosts, so that no harm ever befell one of them because of him. As he mastered the language, he learned many things concerning these remarkable people. Prince Commodore Florenzel almost daily took it upon himself to assist in the instruction of his colossal guest. And it was from him that Tarzan learned most. Nor were his eyes idle as he strolled around the city. Particularly interesting was the method of construction used in erecting the comparatively gigantic dome houses, which towered high above even the great Tarzan. The first step in the construction was to outline the periphery of the base, with boulders of uniform size, and weighing perhaps 50 pounds each. 2 slaves easily carried such a boulder, when it was slung in a rope hammock. And as thousands of slaves were employed, the work progressed with rapidity. The circular base, with a diameter of 150 to 200 feet, having been outlined. Another, smaller circle, was laid about 10 feet inside the first. 4 openings being left in each circle, to mark the location of the 4 entrances, to the completed building. And corresponding, to the 4 principal cardinal points of the compass. The walls of the entrances were then outlined upon the ground with similar large boulders. These, being a little more carefully selected for uniformity. After which, the 4 enclosures thus formed, were packed closely with boulders. The corridors and chambers of the first floor were then outlined, and the spaces between filled with boulders. Each being placed with the utmost care and nicety in relation to those touching it, and those that should rest upon it, when the second course was laid. For these were to support a tremendous weight, when the edifice was completed. The corridors were generally 3 feet wide, the equivalent of 12 feet by our standards. While the chambers varied in dimensions, according to the uses to which they were to be put. In the exact center of the building, a circular opening was left that measured 10 feet in diameter. And this was carried upward, as the building progressed, until the whole formed an open shaft, from ground floor to roof, in the completed edifice. The lower course, having been built up in this manner to a height of 6 inches. Wooden arches were placed at intervals the lengths of the corridors, which were now sealed over, by the simple expedient of fastening thin wooden strips lengthways of the corridors, from arch to arch, until the corridors were entirely roofed. The strips, or boards, which overlapped one another, were fastened in place by wooden dowels, driven through them, into the peripheries of the arches. As this work was progressing, the walls of the various chambers, and the outer wall of the building, were raised to a height of 24 inches, bringing them to the level of the ceilings of the arched corridors. And the spaces between chambers and corridors were packed with boulders, the interstices between which were filled with smaller stones and gravel. The ceiling beams were then placed across the other chambers. Timbers 6 inches square, hewn from a hard, tough wood being used. And in the larger chambers, these were further supported, at intervals, by columns of the same dimensions and material. The ceiling beams being in place, they were covered over with tight-fitting boards, doweled to place. The ceilings of the chambers now projected 6 inches above the surrounding course of the structure. And at this juncture, hundreds of cauldrons were brought in, which a crude asphalt was heated, until it became liquid. And the interstices of the next 6-inch course were filled with it, bringing the entire completed course to the same level at a height of 30 inches. Over all of which a second 6-inch course of rock and asphalt was laid. And the second story, laid out and completed in a similar manner. The palace of Adandroharchis, constructed in this way, was 220 feet in diameter, and 110 feet high, with 36 floors capable of housing 80,000 people, a veritable anthill of humanity. The city consisted of 10 similar domes, though each slightly smaller than the king's, housing a total of 500,000 people, 2/3 of whom were slaves. These being for the most part the artisans and body servants of the ruling class. Another 500,000 slaves, the unskilled laborers of the city, dwelt in the subterranean chambers of the quarries, from which the building material was obtained. The passageways and chambers of these mines were carefully shored and timbered, as the work progressed, resulting in fairly commodious and comfortable quarters, for the slaves upon the upper levels at least. And as the city was built upon the surface of an ancient ground moraine, on account of the accessibility of building material, the drainage was perfect, the slaves suffering no inconvenience, because of their underground quarters. The domes themselves were well ventilated through the large central air shaft, and the numerous windows that pierced the outer walls, at frequent intervals, at each level above the ground floor, in which, as previously explained, there were but 4 openings. The windows, which were 6 1/4 inches wide, by 18½ inches high, admitted a certain amount of light, as well as air. But the interior of the dome, especially the gloomy chambers, midway between the windows, and the central light and air shaft, was illuminated by immense, slow-burning smokeless candles. Tarzan watched the construction of the new dome with keenest interest, realizing that it was the only opportunity that he ever would have to see the interior of one of these remarkable human hives. And as he was thus engaged, Commodore Florenzel and his friends hastened to initiate him into the mysteries of their language. And while he learned the language of his hosts, he learned many other things of interest about them. The slaves, he discovered, were either prisoners of war, or the descendants of prisoners of war. Some had been in bondage for so many generations that all trace of their origin had become lost. And they considered themselves as much citizens of Trohanadalmarcus, the city of King Aidandroharchis, as did any of the nobility. On the whole, they were treated with kindness, and were not overworked, after the 2nd generation. The recent prisoners, and their children were, for the most part, included in the caste of unskilled labor, from which the limit of human endurance was exacted. They were the miners, the quarriers and the builders, and fully 50% of them were literally worked to death. With the 2nd generation, the education of the children commenced. Those who showed aptitude for any of the skilled crafts, being immediately transferred from the quarries to the domes, where they took up the relatively easy life of a prosperous and indulged middle class. In another manner might an individual escape the quarries, by marriage, or rather by selection, as they choose to call it, with a member of the ruling class. In a community where class consciousness was such a characteristic of the people, and where caste was almost a fetish, it was rather remarkable that such connections brought no odium upon the inferiors, but, on the contrary, automatically elevated the lesser to the caste of the higher contracting party. It is thus, deliverer of the son of Aidandroharchis, explained Commodore Florenzel, in reply to Tarzan's inquiry. Relative to this rather peculiar exception to the rigid class distinctions the king's son had so often impressed upon him. Ages ago, during the reign of Clemata Amorosal in the city of Trohanadalmarcus, the warriors of Vultopis Hargo, king of the city of Veltopis Macus, marched upon our fair Trohanadalmarcus. And in the battle that ensued, the troops of our ancestors were all but annihilated. Thousands of our men and women were carried away into slavery. And all that saved us from being totally wiped out was the courageous defense that our own slaves waged for their masters. Clemata Amorosal, from whom I am descended, fighting in the thick of the fray, noted the greater stamina of the slaves. They were stronger than the warriors of either city, and seemed not to tire at all. While the high caste nobility of the fighting clans, though highly courageous, became completely exhausted after a few minutes of fighting. After the battle was over, Clemata Amorosal called together all the chief officers of the city, or rather, all who had not been killed or taken prisoner, and pointed out to them that the reason our city had been defeated was not so much because of the greater numbers of the forces of the King Veltopis Hargo, as due to the fact that our own warriors were physical weaklings. And he asked them why this should be, and what could be done to remedy so grievous a fault. The youngest man among them, wounded and weak from loss of blood, was the only one who could offer a reasonable explanation, or suggest a means of correcting the one obvious weakness of the city. He called their attention to the fact that of all the race of Minunians, the people of the city of Trohanadalmarcus were the most ancient, and that for ages there had been no infusion of new blood, since they were not permitted to mate outside their own caste, while their slaves, recruited from all the cities of Minuni, had interbred, with the result that they had become strong and robust, while their masters, through inbreeding, had grown correspondingly weaker. He exhorted Clemata Amorosal to issue a decree, elevating to the warrior class any slave that was chosen as mate by either a man or woman of that class, and further to obligate each and every warrior to select at least one mate from among their slaves. At first, of course, the objections to so iconoclastic a suggestion were loud and bitter. But Clemata Amorosal was quick to sense the wisdom of the idea. And not only did he issue the decree, but he was the first to espouse a slave woman. And what the king did, all were anxious to do also. The very next generation showed the wisdom of the change. And each succeeding generation has more than fulfilled the expectations of Clemata Amorosal. Until now, you see in the people of Trohanadalmarcus, the most powerful and warlike of the Minunians. Our ancient enemy, Veltopis Macus, was the next city to adopt the new order. Having learned of it, through slaves taken in raids upon our own community. But they were several generations behind us. Now all the cities of Minuni wed their warriors with their slave women. And why not? Our slaves were all descended from the warrior class of other cities, from which their ancestors were captured. We all are of the same race, we all have the same language, and in all important respects, the same customs. Time has made some slight changes in the manner of the selection of these new mates. And now, it is often customary to make war upon another city, for the sole purpose of capturing their noblest born and most beautiful women. For us of the royal family, it has been nothing less than salvation from extinction. Our ancestors were transmitting disease and insanity to their progeny. The new pure, virile blood of the slaves has washed the taint from our veins. And so altered has our point of view become, that whereas in the past, the child of a slave woman and a warrior was without caste, the lowest of the low. Now they rank highest of the high, since it is considered immoral for one of the royal family to wed other than a slave. And your wife? Asked Tarzan. You took her in a battle with some other city. I have no wife, replied Commodore Florenzel. We are preparing now to make war upon Veltopis Macus, the daughter of whose king, we are told by slaves from that city, is the most beautiful creature in the world. Her name is Janzara, and as she is not related to me, except possibly very remotely, she is a fit mate for the son of Aidandroharchis. How do you know she is not related to you? Asked the ape-man. We keep as accurate a record of the royal families of Veltopis Macus, and several others of the nearer cities of Minuni, as we do of our own, replied Commodore Florenzel, obtaining our information from captives. Usually from those who are chosen in marriage by our own people. For several generations, the kings of Veltopis Macus have not been sufficiently powerful or fortunate to succeed in taking royal princesses from us, by either force of arms or strategy. Though they never have ceased attempting to do so. And the result has been that they have been forced to find their mates in other, and oftentimes distant cities. The present king of Veltopismachus, Elcamo, the father of the princess Janzara, took his mate, the mother of the princess, from a far distant city that has never, within historic times, taken slaves from Trohanodalmarchus. Nor have our warriors visited that city, within the memory of any living man. Janzara therefore, should make me an excellent mate. But what about love? Suppose you should not care for one another, asked Tarzan. Commodore Florenzel shrugged his shoulders. She will bear me a son, who will someday be king of Trohanodalmarchus, he replied, and that is all that can be asked. While the preparations for the expedition against Veltopismachus were being carried on, Tarzan was left much to his own devices. The activities of these diminutive people were a never-ending source of interest to him. He watched the endless lines of slaves, struggling with their heavy burdens toward the new dome, that was rising with almost miraculous speed. Or he strolled to the farmlands, just beyond the city where other slaves tilled the rich soil, which they scratched with tiny plows, drawn by teams of diadettes, the diminutive antelope, that was their only beast of burden. Always were the slaves accompanied by armed warriors, if they were slaves of the first or second generation, lest they should attempt escape, or revolution, as well as a protection against beasts of prey, and human enemies. Since the slaves were not permitted to bear arms, and consequently, could not protect themselves, these slaves of the first and second generations were always easily recognizable by the vivid green tunic, reaching almost to the knees, which was the single garment of their caste, and which carried upon both its front and back an emblem, or character in black, that denoted the city of the slave's birth, and the individual to whom he now belonged. The slaves employed upon public works, all belonged to the king, Adandroharchis. But in the fields, many families were represented by their chattels. Moving about the city upon their various duties, were thousands of white-tunicked slaves. They exercised the mounts of their masters, they oversaw much of the more menial and laborious work of the lower caste slaves. They plied their trades, and sold their wares in perfect freedom. But like the other slaves, they wore but a single garment, together with rough sandals, which were common to both classes. On their breasts and backs in red, were the emblems of their masters. The second-generation slaves of the green tunics had a similar emblem. These having been born in the city, and being consequently considered a part of it. There were other, though minor distinguishing marks upon the tunics of the higher caste slaves. Small insignia upon one shoulder or upon both, or upon a sleeve, denoting the occupation of the wearer. Groom, body servant, majordomo, cook, hairdresser, worker in gold and silver, potter, one could tell at a glance the vocation of each. And each belonged body and soul to his master, who was compelled to feed and dome these dependents, the fruits of whose labors belonged exclusively to him. The wealth of one warrior family might lie in the beauty and perfection of the gold and silver ornaments it sold to its wealthy fellows. And in such an instance, all its skilled slaves, other than those required for personal and household duties, would be employed in the designing and fabrication of these articles. Another family might devote its attention to agriculture, another to the raising of diadettes. But all the work was done by the slaves, with the single exception of the breaking of the diadettes, that were bred for riding, an occupation that was not considered beneath the dignity of the warrior class, but rather, on the contrary, looked upon as a fitting occupation for nobles. Even the king's son broke his own diadettes. As an interested spectator, Tarzan whiled the lazy days away. To his repeated queries, as to the possibility of a way out of this bizarre, thorn-infested world. His hosts replied that it was naught to penetrate the forest of thorn trees, but that as it continued indefinitely, to the uttermost extremities of matter, it was quite useless to attempt to penetrate it at all, their conception of the world being confined to what they actually had seen, a land of hills, valleys and forest, surrounded by thorn trees. To creatures of their size, the thorn forest was far from impenetrable, but Tarzan was not their size. Still he never ceased to plan on a means of escape, though he was in no great haste to attempt it, since he found the Minunians interesting, and it suited his present primitive mood, to loll in lazy ease, in the city of Trohanadalmarcus. But of a sudden, a change came early of a morning, just as the first faint promise of dawn was tinging the eastern sky.